Senator Richard Lugar's statesmanship and knowledge of international affairs have earned him the respect of Republicans and Democrats alike. He's been an unwavering advocate for U.S. interests abroad and insists that the U.S. take a leadership role in international affairs. IPFW has decided to honor him by creating the Richard G. Lugar Scholars of International Affairs program. Each academic year, one student and one faculty member are named the Lugar Scholars. The student spends the fall semester in Washington, D.C. as an intern in the Senator's office, as well as in the office of the Senate Foreign Relations Office, which is chaired by Senator Lugar at this time. And then in the spring semester serves as an intern or research assistant for the faculty scholar. The faculty scholar focuses a research agenda on international affairs, trying to help us understand the world a little bit better, and serves as a mentor to the Lugar student scholar. The program to this point has been funded by Chancellor Michael Wartell, and we appreciate his support of the program. In 2004, Professor Jim Lutz was named the first Lugar faculty scholar, and is here tonight to discuss his research. Please welcome Professor Jim Lutz.
Well, I guess I should start by saying that I'm honored to have been the first Lugar Scholar, and I agree with the introduction that Senator Lugar has set a high standard for the Senate to follow, as well as others, and he does indeed deserve this honor. In terms of what I chose to do during the spring of last year, and Lisa Greer was the student who went to Washington, D.C. in the fall and was kind of a research assistant for me in the spring, and she collected a lot of this data. And in fact, I gave a preliminary version of the paper, and I'm still working on the data even to this day at a conference. But basically what drove the question was that in terms of looking at political openness, i.e. democracy, and economic openness, a liberal market system, or in this particular case measured by openness to trade, which is a very good surrogate for economic openness, because an economic system that is relatively open to trade is relatively free in terms of its domestic economy. There are always, of course, exceptions. But the question was, both economists and political scientists have thought for a long time that the two are related, and it really is in some sense the chicken or the egg question, which came first, the economic openness leading to political openness, or democracy by the very nature of the process leads to greater economic openness in a society. In addition to this kind, and also the suggestion is that this becomes something of a virtuous circle, that democracy and economic openness feed amongst themselves and reinforce each other. And you sometimes, included in that equation has been the idea of economic growth, that openness leads to growth, that democracy leads to growth, and that the virtuous circle also includes positive economic benefits, reinforcing the other two elements as well. The general findings have been that openness to trade and growth have generally been associated. Many researchers have found this part of the virtuous circle to be true. There have been some who have found that, or at least have argued that the support for this proposition is not particularly compelling, that in at least some cases economic growth and openness to trade have not gone together, or at least there's no indication that they're reinforcing each other. But by the same token, I'm not aware of anyone who has ever discovered a negative link between economic openness and growth. It's just not always been true that it's been present in terms of reinforcing each other. There have been, at least in some cases, some periods of time where it's been more obvious than others. So it still seems to be there, and there's no compelling evidence contrary to that part of the proposition. One other possibility, which doesn't really argue against that part of the proposition, but is the idea that economies open up when they're ready to grow, which is a bit different than saying having an open economy leads to the growth, that there may be other factors that create the circumstances for growth at a point in time when our economy will open up domestically and internationally to trade because it's ready to take advantage of the opportunities that are present. And so that's kind of another chicken or the egg question, but I don't want to go too far back into that one, primarily because I can't. The other factors that have come into play that people have suggested for underlying causes of democracy, and some of these we can discuss kind of as being the economic leads the political, and others the political leads the economic. And ultimately what I was trying to do with the research was determine if one came first. And actually I did kind of come up with an answer to that, but I'll hold that for the moment. One of the things that has been suggested for democracy is that you have to have a strong middle class, particularly an entrepreneurial middle class. As Professor Wolf mentioned to me, his famous comment, the succinct comment, no middle class, no democracy, or actually, as he put it, no bourgeoisie, no democracy, because bourgeoisie has the context of a merchant middle class as opposed to a salaried middle class or bureaucratic middle class, which is bureaucrats are not normally known for being entrepreneurial or market-driven. And so it's a strong middle class with a market economy has been associated with democracy. And of course, the suggestion is that, of course, if you have a strong middle class, you tend to have a stronger middle class if you have a market economy, because that gives opportunities for entrepreneurs. So that one might be that the economic precedes the political in terms of one leading to the other. Another underlying cause of democracy, or relationship with democracy that's been fairly clear, is between an economic threshold, a wealth threshold, if you will. Very poor countries have trouble establishing effective democracies. It turns out to be much easier for richer countries. There's lots of tables that have put together. I came across one that was basically for 1976, which was kind of the start of the period I used. And there were 31 countries that were very poor, and only 3 were democratic or moving towards democracy. At the upper end, there were 23 countries that had GNP per capita of over $3,000. 1976 now. $3,000 wouldn't be rich today, but 30 years ago, that was $3,000 went further. And 20 of the 23 were either democratic or moving towards democracy. And so there's been long noted an economic threshold that you have to get over a certain point to where literally you can worry about democracy once you can feed, clothe, and house yourselves. And one could suggest perhaps that this has some connection with a market system, though not necessarily, but at least it's an economic factor that seems to precede political democracy. The oil-producing countries, of course, are a partial exception to this, either in 76 or if you go into 1985 when they were suddenly much richer because of a couple of oil crises that redounded to their benefit. You find that here's an indication where you have wealth but no democracy. And contrary to this, but carrying it back to the first point, the oil economies don't have a strong entrepreneurial middle class. It doesn't take an entrepreneurial middle class to pump oil, and takes a little bit of entrepreneurial skills to get higher prices for it. But they lack the market economy and the entrepreneurial middle class. And even at some level, because the oil in the oil-producing states accrues to the government, it actually reinforces the strength of the government rather than the middle class, because all the wealth goes into the government coffers. One other aspect of this, and I think it's a classic comment on oil-producing economies, just as the American Revolution was, of course, no taxation without representation. In the case of the oil economies, it's kind of the reverse of that, no representation without taxation. Saudi Arabia derived something, it's probably gone up a little bit lately, but at one point derived something like 0.1% of its budget from direct taxes. And of course, if you're taxing citizens, they're less likely to get upset about what the government is doing. In democracies, one way to get the people involved very quickly is to talk about raising taxes. Suddenly the population is mobilized if they're afraid you're going to raise their taxes. But if you're providing services, particularly at a relatively high level, and you're not taxing anyone for it, it doesn't seem to generate the intense interest that comes up in other contexts. Literacy is another factor related to democracy, but obviously wealthier countries are more literate. Literacy is also tends to be associated with more complex economies because one of the things, education, of course, is important in its own right. That's what IPFW and universities are all about. But one of the driving forces behind educating the population in general was the need for an educated industrial workforce in factories, that literacy was a requirement. And so with entrepreneurial middle class and progress and economic growth comes the greater need for literacy. At least early on in some cycles. I think there's probably a much greater appreciation for education in its own right, except for state legislatures here and there, in a more general context. Another aspect to all this is globalization seems to have increased wealth because the international market does generate a more efficient use of resources. One can argue about the distribution of the benefits and the distribution of the gains. But in some senses, this can be a mixed blessing. Globalization may lead to rapid growth, which may be destabilizing. It seems to be the case that slower growth turns out to be much more effective in a slower pattern of growth and permits a political system to adjust, and it doesn't face shocks. So globalization could be a mixed blessing. One other interesting aspect, Samuel Huntington suggested that in terms of democratization, for authoritarian regimes are obviously the candidates for the new democratic countries because there are no others. Democracies already qualify. And in a sense, authoritarian regimes of their various kinds are either going to be victims of their success or victims of their failures. An authoritarian regime that faces economic failure is usually replaced by a different kind of authoritarian regime. An authoritarian regime that has economic success often creates the basis for democracy. So here is a suggestion that the economic precedes the political, that economic gain, and whether or not it be associated with market forces is a different issue, but economic gain precedes political democracy. That's implicit in the suggestion. It suggests, however, that authoritarian regimes are going to change at some level. To set the stage in a little more detail, some specific suggestions. The middle class benefits from a more open economy. However you get to that open economy. Government decision, happenstance, changing global economic situations that force an open economy upon a country. The middle class benefits from an open economy. It provides more opportunities for entrepreneurial skills. You reduce monopolies and state rules and regulations. And so you have a greater opportunity for the middle class in the open economy and less advantage to the elite. And to this aspect of a developing middle class leads to democracy would suggest that the economic precedes the political. On the other hand, in democratic states, middle classes can win election victories and thereby can, by conscious choice, pursue policies that open up the economy. So first you have the democratic openness and the middle class perceiving that if they can win an election, that it is their advantage to open up the economy, because again, the existing elites are likely to have benefited from monopolies and state rules and regulations. And so you open up the economy. If you take this view of the role of the middle class, the political precedes the economic. So political openness comes first and economic openness comes second. Another element, multinational corporations, surprisingly to many, prefer countries with more civil liberties and political freedoms as a source of investment. The conventional wisdom, if wisdom is the appropriate term, is of course that they prefer dictatorial regimes. Presumably at some point in time that was perhaps because you could bribe dictators more readily than democratic politicians, but I'm not quite sure of the wisdom of even that point of view, given the number of politicians who occasionally find themselves in trouble for accepting gratuities of one kind or another. Tom DeLay comes to mind. Actually, multinational corporations probably, though there's research that finds that multinational corporations probably prefer above all else stability, where they know what they can count on for their future, but this would tend to imply that at least in some periods of time, multinational corporations see democracies as inherently more stable than authoritarian regimes. That may or may not be the case. Of course, multinational corporations were rushing into Eastern Europe in the early 1980s because they knew what was going on and the system was very stable, and they could, no problems, it's not democratic, but we know what's going on and it's very stable and we know where it's going to be 10 years from now. Well, they were wrong, but so were lots of other people, including a lot of political scientists. So, but again, multinational corporations, this would suggest that the political precedes the economic because the investment will generate growth and open up the economy. It's been suggested that democracy provides for secure property rights, which favor growth and investment, a variation on the theme. But this is, again, a stability factor, but democracy tends to enshrine property rights. Finally, it's also been suggested that middle classes able to make their own economic decisions then begin to feel much more competent to make political decisions. That if once you let them think for themselves, even if it's only in the economic sphere, then you're going to run into the expectation that they can begin to make plans in the political sphere as well. So this one assumes that the economic precedes the political. I could go on at this at some length, but I'm going to stop with that one and raise one more basic caveat about this approach. And that's to point out that democratic political systems do not always have open economic systems. The discussion assumes that's always the case, but obviously that's not true in some cases. In terms of the Great Depression, had a lot of elements involved in it, but one of them was the fact that democracies were willing to raise tariffs against imports just as much as the non-democracies in the world system. The Smoot-Hawley tariff, the infamous Smoot-Hawley tariff, which was actually after the Great Depression, but that's the highest tariff the United States ever had. The one that it replaced was the second highest tariff that we ever had. And both of those were passed by a democracy. Here was a democracy that wasn't the United States, that wasn't particularly open. And Great Britain, the great free trader of the world, had protective tariffs and other devices used to regulate imports at the same time period. Democracies, because of the nature of interest group interactions, can protect certain domestic industries, like steel, like automobiles, like textiles. Those are the big three in the United States, but there are others like agricultural products. There's all kinds of protection that goes on. The European Union has incredibly high protection for agricultural products, and Japan, which is also very democratic, has different ways of achieving the same goals, but here's all democracies that are not as open as the theory would lead us to believe. One other caveat in this sense is if we look again at Asian countries, the four dragons, Hong Kong formerly, when it could be said, in South Korea and Singapore and Taiwan, or the Republic of China, which are the economic miracles, the great success stories of Asia, all of them became economic success stories without being democratic at the time. Hong Kong was a crown colony with no internal self-government. South Korea, for most of the period of time of its great growth, was under a succession of military regimes. It was a classic military regime. Singapore was a dominant one-party regime where the opposition was held very much in check, and any time opposition leaders appeared to be becoming too successful, they would find themselves in violation of election laws, which would mean, if they were lucky, their candidacies were disallowed. If they were not so lucky, they had jail terms, relatively brief ones. It was not a heavy-handed repression, but it was a one-party state that wasn't about to lose an election. Taiwan, or the Republic of China, was a mixture of civilian and military factors, but not a democratic country at the time. The military role and the party's civilian leadership role, the civilians were increasing in relative power while the military was declining. It was early on more military, towards the end less military. Now, Korea and Taiwan are relatively democratic at the present time. Hong Kong is now part of China and therefore is not particularly democratic, even less democratic than it was. And Singapore hasn't changed much. One final example is that Chile underwent great economic liberalization, but it was under the Pinochet regime. So here was an anything but democracy that undertook economic liberalization. So there are all kinds of potential exceptions. So in any event, that's kind of the background and the results, and I will spare you the detailed statistical analysis and the endless tables and just kind of summarize it. Basically, it was looking at political openness measured by Freedom House. Is an organization that has provided rankings of countries of the world from 1973 to the present time. I got as far as 1992 for the analysis that I've run. I'm currently updating the data, but I haven't run it. So this covers 1973 to 1992, 20-year period. The Freedom House data starts in 1973. So that's kind of the effective, easy starting point. Freedom House ranks countries on a scale for civil liberties and political liberties. It ranks them 1 to 7. You can add it up. It's 2 to 14. Usually, and there are statistical reasons for this, you then divide it by 2, so it ranges from 1 to 7. So you could have a range from 1 to 7, with 1 being the most democratic and 7 being the least democratic, because that's simply the way Freedom House started, with 1 being good and 7 being bad. And it works just as well as the other way. The openness to trade was a little more complex, but suffice it to say there's a fairly reasonable measurement of determining what the actual openness of various economies is to trade, and using that as a surrogate for the openness of the whole economy, because we can talk about free market economies, but we can't really measure it. Well, we can measure, there's the former centrally planned economies, which didn't have many market mechanisms. There was Hong Kong, which was the only real free market economy because there were virtually no restrictions on trade. And then there's everybody else who have some restrictions. And how do you count a national company? where the government owns the company? How do you account for rules and regulations, which every country has rules and regulations limiting what is done? How do you take into account potential corruption and side payments that have to be made, which are, well, I guess you could consider them market mechanisms in some cases, but in other cases they're not. It's actually easier to measure trade because you know what goes in and what goes out, barring smuggling, and that's not a big problem for most goods. And the goods that are usually smuggled don't show up in the economic figures anyhow because it's drugs and such like. So we had a measure of political openness, and the one for trade openness had to be derived, but it takes a little bit of effort to do it, but it works pretty well. And so the first step, looking at economic openness leading to political openness. From 1973 to 1980, there was moderately strong and consistent patterns that supported the idea that economic openness led to political openness. From 1981 and 1982, very weak evidence, and from 83 to 1992, nothing. So for about half the period, support for the basic idea, and the second half of the period, it kind of failed. The next step was to look at political openness leading to economic openness. We're still doing the chicken and egg thing. From 1973 to 1978, the relationship was moderately strong and consistent that political openness led to economic openness. From 1979 to 1982, it looked weaker. There's still indications that it disappears. Since I'm a political scientist, I have to say, unfortunately, looking at the figures, the comparison is fairly obvious that the strength of the association between economic openness leading to political is stronger than political leading to economic. It's not just, they both are about the same, they both cover the same time periods, but with statistics you can look at the strength of the association, and there's very little doubt that, as the chicken and the egg question, economic openness seems to predate political openness. It seems that the economic openness has a greater impact on political openness down the road than the reverse. So it is possible that the economists have it right. Probably by accident. One of Jagdish Bhagwati is a world-class economist. And he's a world-class economist because of what he does, but he's probably a world-class economist because he has a sense of humor as well, which usually isn't obvious with economists. And in one of his writings, he's talking about the upsurge in the global economy, and he says, of course, all the economic theories put forward by all the various groups of economists can explain the upsurge in the economy because they're all right. He said, well, there's enough credit to go around, let them all take credit, and everybody's happy, but suggesting that they're all right and they're all wrong at the same time. But it does seem to be the case that, at least for this period, particularly that 10-year period, there is much, the evidence is stronger that the economic precedes the political, that the economic openness helps fuel a drive towards democracy, if you will. Now, the other question is why it disappears. And I've actually given more thought to that, and there are two basic reasons come to mind that help to explain the disappearance of the phenomena, where the linkage starts to disappear. And one is what has been referred to as the contagion or snowballing effect. Is that you reach a point where it becomes difficult for regimes to maintain non-democratic styles of government what Samuel Huntington has called a wave of democratization. And so they are forced to democratize the system, to open up the political system, regardless of any preconditions or any other factors that might actually have fueled a desire for an open democratic system. The pressure of the example or the model provided by other countries. It becomes harder, if you're one dictator amongst many, it's easier to resist the push for democratization. If you're one of the last surviving dictators, Stroessner in Paraguay, well, actually, they had to wait for him to die, but when he died, they opted for at least to try a democratic system. So, if this is indeed the case, it starts to be indeed a wave of democratization, at least an attempt, or at least perhaps faux democratization, in which you pretend to give up power, but you don't really do it, or you agree to hold free elections, and because of the nature of the situation, you're probably going to win the first election. It's easy to be democratic with a small d when you're winning elections. Democratic with a large D, wouldn't have much experience with that recently. But it's easy, as long as you can win, you can be democratic. It's harder to be democratic when you have to turn over office to the opposing parties. So the contagion is one. A second factor, and this clearly seems to fit beginning in the mid-'80s, is the influence of external actors. And Huntington has noted that after World War II, there was a wave of democratization because the Allies won. And if we just kind of ignore the Soviet Union, the Allies were basically democratic. Well, some of our friends in Latin America weren't all that democratic either. But generally speaking, the good guys won, and the democracies won, so there was an impetus for changing over to democracy. And much of Latin America went through a wave of democratization that was later reversed in Huntington's terms, and when they went back to military rule. Well, in this case, it was the Cold War victory and the breakdown of communism in Eastern Europe, and the disappearance that was becoming obvious of the Soviet Union as the other superpower. And so you see a wave of democratization, which is the result of the influence of external actors, the United States and the European Union countries in particular, and for many parts of the world, it depended on which part of the world, which country, but in the case of the European Union, the expectation, of course, that you don't get in unless you're an established democracy. That is now a formal rule for the European Union, but when it was the European community, it was an informal rule. You didn't get into the European communities if you weren't a democracy. Spain and Portugal had to wait until they were democracies in order to get in, and everybody understood the informal rule, even if it wasn't a formal rule. And so there were the presumed and real enough economic advantages of entering into the European communities and the European Union. That was a positive benefit. The United States was preferred to support democracies when it could, but not that it always supported democracies, but there was always a preference for that. And again, with the United States gaining the upper hand in the Cold War, if you will, there was increasing pressure as well. So changing external events, which would affect all countries relatively equally. And of course, the decline of the Soviet Union as an aid giver and a trade partner for its allies would come into play. And an even amount of, even an element of self-interest for the governments and countries involved, because it was the European Union and the United States and Japan that could provide aid and support and other factors that might help their economies, and this was true regardless of level of market openness or whatever. So again, a transference into a broader area. So there's reasons to a more refined analysis for the future might be, once again updating the data, is to look to see if the former centrally planned economies and the successor states to the Soviet Union, what kind of patterns they follow. Because while most of Eastern Europe has have reasonable democracies, most have reasonable democracies, the successor states to the Soviet Union have a more mixed record, ranging from the Baltic states that are democratic enough to be in the European Union to Belarus, which is not democratic enough to be in the European Union or even close, and former Soviet Central Asia, which are basically non-democratic regimes. But there's more to be done. But in a sense, this seemed like the kind of research that really fit in well with the Lugar scholarship. It's not that I chose it for that reason. It just happened to be something I was working on that seemed to fit in with what the Lugar faculty scholar and student scholarship, the whole program was designed to do. And so I chose to pursue it at the time, and I will keep up with it and everything else I'm doing for at least the immediate future.
Since you said that you made the point that being one among many in terms of dictators is easier than being one among the few, will you be throwing any sort of variable, or have you looked at developing a variable that will measure proximity issues, or do you think it's a spatial thing, or is it something else?
Well, early on in my career, long ago, I did argue it was a spatial thing. Spatial, that's proximity, just simply geographic proximity, had an influence on not so much democratization, but coups d'états in one-party states. I think that is an element, but is much less likely to be true in today's world. It's the global community or whatever other cliche, but it's you can skip over intervening countries. You can look at similar countries, and with the internet and the speed of communications, I think it's less likely to be proximity. Although Jörg Steiner suggested in Eastern Europe you could see a geographic pattern of moving from west to east, or from northwest to southeast, that Romania and Bulgaria and Albania were the last because they were the furthest removed. And thought of developing that kind of variable. I even know how it would be done, but with 100 and some odd countries of the world, it would require a research assistant to do all the legwork.
Scholar thing again.
Yeah, you have to finish up, right? No, it's a good point. But I'm not going to plan to undertake that anytime soon. Now, if I could do vector and matrix manipulations on the computer, it would be a little quicker. But setting up the matrix is. I've done it before for smaller data sets, and it was always easier to do it by hand than to try to figure out how to do it on the computer.
So I'm wondering if you want to have a hypothesis for when you do the 1990s data, because I would imagine you might really fall into finding that the not counterintuitive, but another answer is that the second wave of democracy that is talked about in the 70s, Southern Europe, and some of these other nations, then this relationship's strong. It kind of craps out during the 80s. I'm not TV, I probably shouldn't. But then in the 90s, then maybe with the third wave, this relationship would pick up again. Do you have any hypotheses on that? Or?
I think that one possibility is that if I separate out the former centrally planned economies separately, because I did a lag time to see if 1983, what its effect was going to be for the next 4 or 5 years. And if I separated out the former centrally planned economies, and I planned to do it, I didn't do it for this because I had 2-3 years for it to, I could take them out, but I couldn't put them by themselves. But with more data, look at them separately, look at the rest of the world separately, look at the centrally planned economies separately, and look at them together. And the real confounding factor may be the introduction of these former centrally planned economies into the mix, because they're not in there in the earlier years. I mean, we have, Freedom House has no trouble giving them a number, which usually ranges from 10 to 14 for political liberties and civil liberties. The problem is getting a measure of trade openness, because while they were centrally planned economies, the measures, the national accounting of the communist countries other than Yugoslavia was a little flaky. And so the results, to use a technical term, or maybe I should use your technical term, was a little crappy. But you can't really correlate them. People have gone in, and we have some fairly good data for the centrally planned economy. When somebody's gone in and transformed it, Paul Mayer down at IU Bloomington did that for a period of time, where it took him a long time to come up with a really great set of data for the centrally planned economies that you could use with data from the rest of the world. So the earlier period doesn't have the centrally planned economies because I can't generate the trade openness. Later on, I can. So the confounding factor may be the introduction of these countries into the data set, and so separating them out and doing it before and after might lengthen the influence into the time, and see whether or not it holds. Well, we might have two groups. It might be true for the former centrally planned economies, just within them, that the more market-oriented are the more democratic. But they had relatively higher standards of living when they became democratic. Their route was different than many of the developing world countries. I should have added, of course, I did not include the Western European countries or the United States in the analysis, because they all got ones or twos, and they're all fairly well open. I was looking to see the influence within developing countries, or basically the 20-odd countries of the developing world were excluded.
Could you say a little bit more about how you measured openness for trade? You kind of jumped over.
Okay, it's basically running a regression analysis with two variables, one of which is the size of the country in terms of population, and one of which is GNP per capita, but not total GNP. That's, people have used that, including economists, which makes absolutely no sense, because you have large poor countries equating with small rich countries, so you put them in separately to control for larger countries will trade less because they can do more internally, all other things being equal. Richer countries will trade more because they have more money. And run a regression and then take the residual values. High residuals are countries that trade more than predicted. Negative residuals are countries that trade less than predicted. And this is the measure of openness, is the residual values after you control for population size and wealth. And then using the residuals as a measure of openness, it holds up. I've done it for lots of other things, which is what led me to do it for this. And it's a very convenient way of actually measuring what is and not worrying about nominal tariffs and effective tariffs and converting non-tariff barriers into tariff equivalents, which economists love to do this, but it doesn't tell you very much, I don't think. And there's problems with the other economic measures, and I've gotten away with using it for lots of things, and nobody's ever called it into question. So I'm assuming it's acceptable. And so that's kind of why I jumped over it. It's a little more. The other thing that sometimes comes into play, but not for this data set, but when I've done it for other things, is if you're dealing with the EU countries, you have to include EU membership, because that, of course, increases trade as well. But for the developing countries, there's all kinds of economic unions, and most of which don't amount to much, so I didn't include any of those. Okay.
Yeah, I have a question about economic openness as a cause of democracy. And I'm thinking about the time period that you studied, 1973 to 1992, I think it was. The interesting thing about that period is that it's just an unprecedented growth in the number of democracies around the world, far more than we've ever seen in the history of the world. And so we have this huge growth. And then at about 92 and continuing to about now, it's plateaued. And what a lot of people have argued about these democracies is that a lot of them are kind of weak. They're, they have the electoral facade, but they don't have the deep, deep roots. And the speculation among many is that, eventually a number of those are going to revert back to dictatorship. And, Huntington himself talks about these waves that go forward and then reverse and then go forward and reverse and sort of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing. And you're familiar with all this, but I'm just setting the stage. But my question is that I wonder if economic openness could be a greater cause of democracy than your study would indicate if you took the longer time period, including the future. So this requires you to speculate a bit. But perhaps in the future, what we see is that a lot of these democracies actually don't end up staying democracies, and maybe it's the ones that do, the new democracies that do stay democracies. Maybe those countries do stay democracies because they actually had more economic openness or a stronger middle class to begin with. And I know there's no way you could have studied this because this includes the future, but it's an interesting idea.
You could plot out the numbers.
Well, okay, so
Backward,
extrapolate.
Yeah. Extrapolate.
Or actually, it's a very good idea. One way to do it would be to take the data I have, look at 1992. The openness data is pretty straightforward. And look, Freedom House is still generating its numbers, and very easily to see if to test well, not very easily, but could test the proposition that if look at them in 1992 and the ones that were weak economically in terms of their openness, see, because there have been some that have fallen off, and see what indeed has happened. So it is, could divide it into, or taking 83 or 85 would be a fairly logical, obvious starting point given the discontinuity in the data, and see what it looks like. Again, probably looking at the centrally planned economy separately because the former communist countries are a different group in some sense, but no, I guess it could be done. Going further back would be great. Unfortunately, I could always ask Freedom House to go back and generate a data set for me beginning about 1950 to cover all the intervening years, but I suspect they probably wouldn't do that. That's a limitation, and you can sit there and do it yourself, but the amount of time to come up with these scales for all the countries in the world, some are easy. North Korea is a 14. But what makes the data so useful is it has a nice range, and that's what makes that so you can distinguish between really democratic and partially democratic, and you can also distinguish between levels of political closure. Not every authoritarian regime is like North Korea or Iraq under Saddam Hussein.
So I was thinking about how income maldistribution might affect political openness, because a country can develop really quickly, and it can have a rising GNP really fast. But if only a small number of people have that, it's not going to create a country. Whereas a slower growing country, which does maybe distribute that a little bit more evenly, might develop a middle class, that entrepreneurial middle class you were talking earlier, more quickly, and then become more democratic in an earlier time frame. So I was wondering how you might be able to fit that into the study, or whether you would even be able to, because it sounds like something that would be complicated to try and operationalize.
Well, actually, there are a number of publications that have Gini indexes, coefficients of inequality, which are readily available, but they're not readily available for the same countries for a consistent period of time. And It's based on the availability of basically internally generated statistics about the distribution of wealth, which a different chicken or the egg question. Democracies, you tend to have the data available, and it's pretty believable. For non-democratic countries, if it's available, it's not always particularly believable.
That's just what I was thinking. Is we've already talked about how hard it is to get good data for non-open political countries, and so something like that, they would want to disguise it, or at least, or not even talk about it at all.
Yes, the other option is to have no data at all.
Would you be able to, if you start looking at the countries that went to democracy and then fell from democracy or moved away from democracy, could you do it for them? Do you think the data during that time period when they are democracy is good data?
Possibly. I mean, without looking to see which group of countries falls into it. It also would require, at some level, it's an evaluation which I can make at some level for many countries how good the data is, but then ultimately there are many countries where I'd come up at a loss to know how good it is. I'm knowing the internal political system of 80 or 90 countries in the world is a bit much. I tend to use the most obvious examples because they're the most obvious examples, but if what is the true level of income inequality in Bolivia and Peru right now? I could look at figures, but I really would have no feel for those two countries, and I'm picking them because I would not have a feel for knowing how good they are. And so therefore, it's hard to evaluate how much I could use them without having a store of knowledge. That's one nice Freedom House does all the work for me. And the trade data is pretty good too. That's easier to. There's ways of correcting, and that's pretty good too. So it works. And population figures and GNP or purchasing power parity figures, which again now purchasing power parity figures are better than GNP, but they don't go back to 73. They go back to 73 for a select group of countries, and about 1980 is a larger group of countries. And for the last 5 or 6 years, or maybe even the last 10, there's purchasing power parity figures for everyone, but to switch in midstream creates other kinds of.
Thank you very much, Jim.